Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our virtual fireside chat with President Sarah Mangelsdorf. My name is Katie Mott. I'm the Assistant Director of Student Support Services for the School of Arts, Sciences, and Engineering. I've been working with graduate student life staff across all graduate schools to bring you Graduate Student Appreciation Week, and we're particularly excited about the opportunity to bring you this unique event. President Mangelsdorf, we're so honored to have you joining us today. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. And I also want to introduce our guest interviewer, Katie Gregory, who is a first-year PhD candidate in the Earth and Environmental Sciences program. Thank you, Katie, for taking on this special role.
Thank you.
We have a number of topics planned for our conversation today, but we do also want to hear what questions you have for President Mangelsdorf, so please feel free to submit those through the Q&A function in the webinar. Our plan is to have Katie lead the conversation for the next half hour or so, and then we'll respond to some of the questions we've received from the group. So to get started, I want to invite President Mangelsdorf to say a few words.
I want to thank you for inviting me to this conversation. It isn't quite the way we had first planned it, of course. I think when I was approached about doing a fireside chat with graduate students, I think we were envisioning something in person rather than via Zoom. But here we are in the midst of this pandemic where everything is a little different than we thought it would be. And I think my remarks are going to be a little different than they might have been because I imagine you're all a little worried, just as I am, about all the things that are uncertain. And I've heard from some graduate students about the things they're uncertain about. I hope that everyone who's on today is at least safe and healthy wherever you're sheltering in place. And we are really facing an unprecedented moment in history together, and we don't know exactly where we'll come out on the other end. The situation is tough, and it is especially tough on graduate students. I think about graduate students I know who are planning on going on the job market this coming year and wondering, what will that look like? And we really don't know what it will look like. We also don't know, many of our international students are here and maybe can't get home, or we have international students who've gone home and wonder whether they can come back. And so I don't have all the answers for all of you, but I want you to know that the University of Rochester is committed to providing the support we can to our graduate students. And despite our current challenges, we will never forget that we're an AAU Research One university, which cares very deeply about research and the training of the next generation of scholars. That's you. And to the extent we can support that mission, no matter what happens, we will. And I do understand that the message that Provost Clark and VP Holly Crawford and I sent out yesterday was for faculty and staff was a little distressing to some people to hear that perhaps some people are getting pay cuts and some people may be furloughed. This is a distressing thought, but you know, nationally, the economy is in a little bit of a difficult spot, and we're at record levels of unemployment in our country, and we have faced some serious revenue losses in our medical center and elsewhere on the campus, and we have to, at the end of the day, we will do everything we can to keep the university afloat, which it will be afloat. University of Rochester will be here for many years to come, but that's part of our job, is to assure that that's the case. You know, ever since I first interviewed for the job as the president of the University of Rochester, and indeed, even before that, I was reading up a lot about it. I've always known about the strengths of the psychology department here. I have colleagues here whose work I've been citing for years. And I've known about other particular areas of excellence, but it really, one of the things that drew me to this community is the strength of the academic programs and the strength of the graduate training. I know a number of people who've gotten their PhDs from the University of Rochester and who've gone on to have very successful careers. And so in all different kinds of fields, which is really, really interesting to me. And the strengths that we have across so many different fields, incredibly impressive. So I know we're going through a difficult time as a university, as a community, as a country, as a world, but we'll get through this, and we'll be fine in the end. So with that, turn it over to Katie for some questions.
Thank you, President Mangelsdorf. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. And thank you for doing this in this unconventional Zoom kind of way we're all navigating through. I know myself and a lot of other graduate students are excited to hear from you. And with that, I guess we will start off with our first question. So I know you are currently navigating the impact of this worldwide pandemic and with the university and adjusting to working from home, like most of us. And all within your first year. So just to start it off, how are you doing?
I think I'm doing fine. I mean, I think it's hard for all of us. I actually like working with other people and interacting with other people. And I mean, Zoom meetings are fine, but I'd just as soon be with you and other graduate students in person, to be honest. It is certainly a time of uncertainty, as I alluded to, and that's hard. I joke that, last summer I attended a workshop for new college and university presidents that was held by Harvard Graduate School of Education, and we all have a listserv of all these new presidents, and we've been joking recently, what happened? We must have missed the section about leading through a pandemic. That wasn't in the curriculum. There was one about, different budget models in higher ed, and even planning for a recession, budgeting for a recession. There were issues about strategic planning and fundraising and building your leadership team, but there was nothing about planning for a pandemic. And so all of us feel a little bit like, wow, we didn't know this was going to happen, but even really experienced presidents I know who've been in their roles for over 5 years are still finding this a little frightening because there's so many things that are changing every day. And it's so, generally I was having what I thought was really a interesting and pretty good first year as president until this happened. And I still think I feel like the leadership team and working with the faculty senate and trying to be as in touch with students and staff and undergraduates, graduates to understand their concerns and navigate through this with our whole community, our staff, our alumni, hearing different stakeholders. We're trying to do the best we can, and I think we're all working really hard, and I hope, but it is tough.
I can imagine quite a challenge that no one was really ready for. And we are in an unprecedented moment here in our history, and graduate students, like most of us in the Rochester area and elsewhere, are concerned about our research progress, as well as funding, what the future might hold for employment, as you had said. So what guidance can you offer graduate students at this time?
Well, I think there have been various moments. I started as a dean at Northwestern in 2008-09. That was the last time I think of that we had this much of a sort of financial sort of slowdown in our country. That was, though I would say now it's even more dire than it was there then. And there was a lot of concern among graduate students, but lots of institutions and organizations worked to think about ways to, for example, add additional fellowship and postdoc programs for students if there weren't jobs when they first went on the first year that they were planning to go out in the job market. And so I have seen how university communities, and I mean the academic community writ large across the country, really rallied to think flexibly and creatively about how to help graduate students during those times. And so I'd say we'll get through this, and it is uncertain, but when it comes to things like, those of you can't work on your research, this is really frustrating. I mean, even if you're funded, if you're not supposed to go to the lab, except for to do essential functions, the progress of your research is going to be slowed down. And that's true for our faculty. And that's hard on everyone. But for a graduate student who's working on, hey, this is my dissertation research, I've got to get this done. I'm sure it must feel really awful, but our institution will be sensitive to that. Your advisor will be sensitive to that. Understand that there's no way that you'll be able to do it the way you would have done before we had to shelter at home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So just like with our assistant professors, our institution has said, you know what, we'll give them more time on their tenure clocks, because they too were like, wait a second, how am I going to get the work done, the publications, the things I need to go up for tenure? Well, we understand they probably can't do some of those things. And so that's why they'll get additional time on their tenure clock. And I'm hoping we can be as flexible as possible with our graduate students as well.
And we definitely appreciate that flexibility. I know we're all in the same boat here. I know you had kind of compared the situation to the 2008 recession, but it's hard to compare to really anything else in history. I was wondering if you can talk about some of the challenges that you yourself faced as a grad student, or just early on in your career in general, and what you had done to overcome them.
Well, I don't think I faced anything quite like this. When I was finishing graduate school, it was the late 1980s, which actually wasn't a great economic time in our country, particularly either. So there weren't a lot of jobs, but certainly I can't think of anything in my graduate experience that is quite like this. I mean, there were certainly the challenges that all graduate students face, the worries about getting enough publications, having a strong enough record, getting the teaching experience, all of that. And then also, my husband and I met in graduate school, and then we were trying to navigate what would that mean for the two of us to try and get jobs. And that was certainly challenging. And that remains a challenging area in the academy when you have two partners trying to get jobs where they'd like to actually maybe live in the same place. So.
Well, I'm glad it worked out for you guys. I'm sure it was not an easy road to get there.
Yeah, we lived apart the first year that I started as assistant professor, and he was still finishing graduate school. But then mostly we've gotten to live in the same city in the same house, which is great.
And I know you had also touched on the relationship with advisors. For most graduate students, that relationship is critical. Mm-hmm. Did you learn anything in your time as a graduate student that influenced how you advise currently? And what advice do you have for students that are currently navigating that relationship with their advisors in a now virtual space, and also under these different timelines and pressures?
Yeah, I think you do learn a lot from, I had the good fortune to have two different advisors, and I don't know how common that is. In some programs, graduate students may work with more than one faculty member. In other programs, it's discouraged, so there's no one rule of thumb about that. But the graduate program I was in was pretty open to that. And that was great because my advisors both had really different styles, both had a lot of strengths, but just different strengths. And I think I learned different things from the two of them. And one had a really big lab group and was very established and very well known in our field. And the other was an assistant professor, and I was her first PhD student to finish up. And so I got very different things from both of them. And I tried to incorporate the things that were particularly helpful that each of them taught me into my own mentoring. One of my mentors knew that I was always anxious about, writing first drafts and worried that they wouldn't be good enough. And so she'd say, right across the top, very rough draft. And that you'll find that that's quite freeing, that it doesn't have to be perfect. And she said, if you need to, you can even say very, very rough draft. And I guess you could do that now, since if everyone reads things online these days, maybe this, but I would actually print out, these were things I was, typing up and printing out for her. And I would write very, very rough draft. And it was somehow freeing. I know it sounds silly, but it, prevented you from thinking, oh, I have to have it all perfect. And she also said the same thing about public speaking, which was something that made me incredibly anxious as a graduate student. And she said, no, you just have to keep doing it and it gets better. All these things are skills you learn. No one's born knowing how to write abstracts that they submit to meetings to get their papers, etc. You were not born knowing how to write grant proposals or academic papers or how to give lectures. They're skills, and you keep practicing them and you get better and better at them. And that was really, really good advice. And I always encouraged my students to do that, to just keep, we try things in small presentations in lab meeting first. I wouldn't set you out in national conference being giving a big talk if you hadn't first done sort of baby steps along the way. And partly that's a lot of what we're learning, and I'm still learning all the time. I'm trying to learn how to be a president. I think you've got to just say, I'm learning it bit by bit, and I'll get better and better.
Certainly. I think I might take that same advice with the rough draft. That actually sounds like a good, and that actually segues well into our next question, talking about working from home and the work-life balance. I know it's a struggle for most people, and especially grad students now more than ever. How do you juggle your responsibilities, and also what has working from home meant for you?
Well, work-life balance meant one thing when there was you could keep them sort of separate. I actually like the notion that you go to work and you give it your all, but then, I'm someone who just as soon stay late at the office or back in the day in the lab and finish things up, and then go home and be able to focus on my family, to focus on what happened, catch up on what happened in the news that day, and sort of have these different worlds. And you can't do that now. It's all just mixed together, which I find really, really challenging in a way, because it's hard to separate and compartmentalize. It's all blurred together. And when you're trying to, like I was the other day, I was trying to record a video for something, and my daughter slams the door in the middle in another part of the house, or someone comes to the kitchen, shuts the cupboard. I'm like, no, shh, I'm trying to do a video recording. It's just hard to have your life all jumbled together. And look, I can hardly complain. I am living in a 16,000 square foot house, which is the president's house. So we can each all go into our little spaces. But I think of graduate students living in small, maybe the one place where you spread out and work is maybe the kitchen table, which maybe someone else wants to eat at some of the time. I think it's really all muddled right now. And so I think we have to have a whole different set of guidance for ourselves about a work-life balance. But prior to this, I would have said it's important to make sure that no matter how hard you're working, that you also do things that aren't about work, that there are other things in your life that give you pleasure. And I'm not saying what they need to be. For some people, it's listening to music. Right now, we can't go to concerts, but we can still listen to streaming music. We can go to virtual concerts. For some people, it's watching movies. We can't go to movies theaters right now, but maybe we can watch Netflix and movies on Prime. For some people, it's reading different kinds of books that aren't related to our academic discipline, fiction or nonfiction. For some people, for me, exercise has always been important. Reading novels has always been important. Watching movies. I love music. And just having those other things in your life. They also, having friends and maintaining those friendships. And that's hard right now, but try to do it via Zoom, because then you can talk through, life isn't just, you can't be defined solely by your work. I don't think any of us should let ourselves be defined solely by our work.
Absolutely. I know we've been having some Zoom game nights and stuff, but it definitely is hard to, once your office and home mesh, it's kind of hard to separate the two and cut yourself off. So
right.
We can all learn a little bit from that. Right. And you had mentioned in your opening remarks that when you interviewed for the position of president here at the University of Rochester, that you were excited about the graduate programs. And now that you've been here for a little bit, what in particular excites you? And also, what have you learned in your time here about the graduate community?
Well, I don't, what I don't know, and I hope you and others can tell me more about, is what it's like to be a graduate student here. What I know about is like from the outside, the sort of the strengths of the various graduate programs, and there are quite a lot of very different strengths, which I think is one of the things that attracted me. It's not just like we're just known for, you can think of certain schools that are just known for, I mean, if you're going to go get a PhD at Purdue, for example, chances are you'd be, certain fields of engineering, there's certain, whereas we have some of the top music programs in the country. We have strong engineering, strong basic science, humanities, social science. There's strengths across all kinds of areas, which really I found fascinating. That breadth of strengths. But I don't know what it's like for you. But for me, I've experienced the institution as somewhat more siloed than I was hoping it would be. Like, so do you know graduate students in other fields, Katie? Like, do you know any graduate students from Eastman, or do you know any graduate students from the health sciences over in the med school, or?
Not really. That is a good point that you make. Aside from, personal relationships, I know my housemate is over at the medical center. I'm on River Campus. As far as AS&E goes within the disciplines there, I am a member of the GSA, so I've somewhat had some interdepartmental mingling, but as far as across the different schools and everything, I would say that it's based on the individual.
I see. Yeah. And that's sort of, so I think when I ask people about their experience in graduate school, I get different, I think the experiences might be quite different depending on what department or school you're in. And that's true to some extent at most universities, but not all. Like when I was at Northwestern, all graduate students got a guaranteed certain number of years of funding, regardless of which PhD program they were in. That cut across the whole university. And I don't think that's the way it works here. Things like that. They just seem, it's more different schools and even different departments within schools may do things differently.
Understandable. And so with that being said, what then is your vision going forward for graduate education at the U of R?
Well, I don't mean to put Melissa Sturgeapple on the spot, but one of her roles in the provost's office is, I think, to help us build more interconnectivity and across the graduate programs, and to sort of really have some sort of central supports for graduate students. Some universities have a special office called the graduate school, and there's a dean of the graduate school who is responsible for all things related to graduate education. And that could be everything from helping graduate students think about funding and fellowships. It can also be helping them deal with grievance issues or anything. And our model is, as I mentioned before, much more distributed. But I know that Melissa and others have been working on thinking, how do we communicate across the different programs and provide the best possible training we can for our graduate students and the best possible supports.
That sounds great. That's a really nice way to lay out the goals for the program. And has any of that changed really in light of COVID-19, or is there anything additional to add from?
But actually, I think one of the things COVID-19 has pointed out to me is our need for more unified communications, and not just, I've seen that not just in whether we're talking about communications with our graduate students or communications with our students writ large, or communications with our different communities. Like, we don't want to be saying things that contradict one another and confuse one another if we're sending out, different kinds of messaging. And so I think now more than ever, I see the need for some sort of coherent, coordinated strategy for communicating with different constituent groups in our community.
Awesome. And we have time for one last question before we turn to the audience. So as we come to the end of this lovely interview together, I just wanted to ask a little bit more about our community. Most graduate students call Rochester their home, and now it's yours as well. What do you love about living in Rochester? What have you learned about it? And also, what has impressed you about the response of from the community to this pandemic outbreak?
Well, I've really, my husband and I have really enjoyed getting to know the community and getting to know the people. And part of the things we've enjoyed, we kind of can't do right now. Like we love going to hear live music, going to movies at the little movie theater, going to, trying out all kinds of different restaurants. But we also love the natural beauty of the area. And we were out running this morning. There are great places to run here. There are great places to bike. There are great places in the summer to kayak. And we look forward to doing more of that exploration as the parks open up and we can explore more of upstate New York. I think what's really impressed me about the community during this pandemic is people's willingness to really just step up and do the best they can in these circumstances. And it's not easy. I mean, go from you're teaching an in-person class, or your TA leading an in-person discussion section or lab section, and all of a sudden you're just to do it online, and you're given maybe a week notice, and maybe you've never taught online before. I was so worried that would really go badly for so many people, and I don't think that's the case. I actually think in most cases it's gone really quite well. And similarly in our med center, I'm so impressed how everyone rallied together to just do what they needed to do to prepare for COVID and get the hospital beds ready that they needed. And think about all the people that are involved in working in a medical center. People often think of the doctors and the nurses, of course, they're on the front line, and the physicians' assistants. But think of the people who are cleaning the hospital rooms and cleaning the equipment and cleaning, preparing the food. Medical centers are 24/7 operations, and they had to completely change and reorient what they were doing to focus on this pandemic and stop doing elective surgeries and stop doing sort of routine procedures. And they really did an amazing job. And the healthcare they've provided has been fabulous. And I keep thinking about what it's like to go to work when you might be thinking that you're exposing yourself to something that you could perhaps cause you harm or a member of your family harm. So I'll forever be grateful for how they rallied and pulled everything together and are still doing that right now. Luckily we didn't perhaps because of our social distancing, our death rates and have not been the kind of rates that have been seen in some places like New York City, New Jersey, and so on. And I'm very thankful for that, but I'm particularly thankful to everyone involved in the healthcare enterprise for all that they've done. But that's what I've seen throughout the whole university community. They just sort of rallied, okay, courses going online, okay, telemedicine visits, okay, if that's what we have to do, that's what we'll do. And it's amazing that people have been as flexible and willing to make the changes they need to make to serve our students and our patients and so on. So I've been really impressed with the community that way.
That's amazing. And absolutely, I think from what I've seen, most people have risen to the occasion above and beyond. I know I saw the story coming out of the medical center of quite a number of students that decided to graduate early so that they could start working immediately. And it was like, it's amazing.
That was amazing. Yeah, we did a little virtual commencement for them. Mark Taubman and I gave little online speeches. And I was thinking, wow. And I said something like, this isn't the commencement you imagine. But this is the commencement you're getting, you're going off. And I was thinking, imagine if you're a fourth year medical student, maybe you were thinking you're going to have this wonderful celebration in May and then you maybe get a little time off before you start your residency. Nope. A lot of them are gone to work on the front lines here and elsewhere in the state and elsewhere in the country. And that's quite amazing.
Absolutely. So now I think it's time to turn to some of our audience-based questions if we're ready for that.
Sure.
First question here, are classes going to be in person next semester?
You know, I wish I knew. That's something that we were asked. I was on public radio at noon with a number of other higher ed presidents, and we were all asked that. Will you be having in-person classes in the fall? And I'd certainly say I hope so. I really hope so. But we just don't know for sure. And we have to follow the guidance. I mean, every day, when I can, I tune in to what Governor Cuomo has to say, and he just extended our pause, staying in place until May 15th. That's still, more than 3 months from when our fall semester would start. But you'll just have to see. There are lots of things we don't know. We don't know. When they begin doing antibody testing, I think they'll have a better sense of how many people have already been exposed to the coronavirus. Maybe they were asymptomatic, or they never thought of it as coronavirus. They got maybe sort of a mild upper respiratory infection, but perhaps they have the antibodies so that they would not get it again. Depending on how prevalent those antibodies are in the community, the community might have greater immunity than we know, but we just don't know yet. And that testing won't actually start here till next week. And so we're sort of playing it by ear, and I think every institution of higher education in our country is doing the exact same thing, just sort of let's wait and see.
Okay, we have another one here. It says, my question pertains to the process behind the university's decision to have pay cuts at the top. Can you explain the decision behind that 18% number? I ask because I wonder what the university plans to do for the most vulnerable members of our community.
The notion of taking pay cuts at the top is because if pay cuts at the top go further and don't cut into, for me to take an 18% pay cut and for senior administrators is not as big a hit as it would be if you do across the board cuts and everybody took, say you took a smaller percentage, you cut everybody by 5%. Well, first of all, it will hit some people more than others, and 5% of a bigger number is a bigger number, and it gives you more costs, it gives you more savings. And the university needs, we do need to reduce our expenses because we have our revenue coming in because of the changes we had to make in our medical center, and they were the right thing to do from a public health perspective, but we have lost considerable revenues by not doing elective procedures, and various even, routine outpatient procedures are not being done. And so the university has lost a lot of revenue during this particular period. So we need to cut our costs. And I think it's, at first some people were saying, are you just doing this for the optics, and saying, oh, look, and I said, no. If it was just the optics, I'd be the one, and saying the president is taking a pay cut, but we actually need to cut millions. And so we can only get millions if many people take pay cuts, right? So
well, thank you for your honesty.
The second part is, what do you do to protect the most?
The vulnerable in the community.
Well, it depends on how you define. We have certainly thought about, there are some classes of workers who really are unable to do their jobs from home. And some of their supervisors say, well, now with this CARES Act, with the enhanced unemployment benefit, perhaps it would be better to furlough them, because if someone's furloughed, then they would still be on our payroll. They'd come back when we have need for them in their different roles, and they would if they're on university health insurance, their health insurance would continue, and then they would collect the unemployment benefit. And in some cases, perhaps even with that benefit, have greater take home than they do now. So it's certainly something that supervisors and managers are looking at, but it's not up to me to make decisions about exactly where those will be done, because each person who's managing their unit has a better sense of how their workforce is deployed and who can in fact work from home. Some work lends itself more readily who are working from home. But we are very mindful that we don't want to just cut people off without health benefits and so on, and without ways of living, money to support themselves.
Thank you. And we have, first of all, congratulations to whoever asked this question. It says, I'm graduating next month and starting on a tenure track at an R1 institution in the fall. I'm incredibly fortunate to be able to do so. But what advice do you have for someone making the transition from graduate student to junior faculty?
Well, first of all, congratulations. That is really a success story, particularly in the world in which we're living right now. That's quite amazing. And it is a big transition, but it's not really, you've already gone through a number of life transitions. The transition to first going to college is really different than high school, and going to graduate school is really different than college. And so think about it this way: you're just doing more of of what you've done in graduate school, but you have to. I think the thing that I found the hardest in the transition was the juggling all of these different pieces. But you've all done at least some portions of these at different times, and some of you are already juggling a lot of things and are really well prepared, because you have to, if you're going to an R1, you have to have an active research program, and whatever field you're in, what that means. For some of you, that means really you have to set up a lab. For other people, it means that you make sure that you get the time and resources you need. If you're a humanist, to go to the archives that you need that you can access the materials that you need, that you have. So there is this sort of setting up yourself to succeed in your research career. And then there's also some of you here again, I'm not sure, some people have more teaching experience as a graduate student and others have less. If you haven't had that much teaching experience, I think it's a little daunting. But even if I felt like I had teaching experience in graduate school, but they were relatively small classes. Like I taught a summer school class, and I taught one course one semester to 50 students, where a faculty member would come and observe me and give me feedback and all of that. And then I was a new assistant professor, and I had to teach 300 students in a big auditorium, and I walked in, I'd never even spoken into a microphone in my whole life, and I was like, I had no idea what that would be like, and that was kind of stressful. But like my advisor told me, once you keep doing it enough, you eventually you get better and better at it. But so there will be new things. And it is definitely stressful that first year as an assistant professor. So cut yourself some slack, stay connected to your grad student friends and friends elsewhere in the world, and stay connected to, I still sought out advice, and I'm still in touch with both my advisors. One of them wrote the other day the president's email and said, I need to send Sarah a copy. She's one of my former students, a copy of my most recent book. Where should I send it? So use your social networks, and you can ask for help. Like if you don't know how much you should cover in a certain undergraduate survey course, you've never taught this course before, ask to see someone else's syllabus, get some, ask for help. There are people there to help you. But congratulations, that is really great news.
Well, that's awesome. I can imagine myself in front of a 300-person lecture with my complexion. I would be bright red. So.
Oh, well, that happened, but I threw up the first day before I went to teach. I was so nervous. That happened for too long, got over it, but it was, oh my God. I gave my first lecture that was supposed to be 15 minutes long in 20 minutes. And the students were just sitting there stunned. And afterwards, I had like stars in front of my eyes because I literally spoke so quickly that I wasn't breathing. So I think I hyperventilated. And I learned in subsequent lectures, I would write in the margins, breathe, pause, smile. And so later in life, when I went on to win teaching awards, and people would say to me, somebody said to me, well, you've always been a good teacher. I'm like, oh, no, I haven't. No, I haven't.
You weren't in that first class.
You should have seen my early classes. They were gems.
This is a bit of a briefer one. Is there a possibility of labs being reopened even if classes over the summer and now remain online?
So is the question is, will labs open over the summer?
Yeah, or just in general, will they reopen even if classes are online going forward?
There again, the lab guidance, we take a lot of our lead from both our state government and what the federal government recommends. And so, it's still there's certain essential functions in labs that can still go on. But right now, we're really not supposed to be at full strength in our labs. But until we get guidance that says that we could go back to full staff, but they might come up with, who knows, like NIH and NSF could come up with guidance for us. DOE, like you can have a density of number of people you could have in a lab space. There are certain functions that must go on in our laser lab. There are certain functions that are going on in some of our other labs, and they will continue to go on. And as soon as we can send more people back in safely, we will, but we do have to follow the state and federal guidance. And then as to whether labs would open fully if classes didn't, I wouldn't think so, because I would think if I just, I listened to Cuomo's briefings, if they were concerned about that, having people in classes in close quarters would make it unsafe for people to come back to residential campuses in September, then they would probably also be giving us guidance that, working closely together in a lab could pose a health risk. So I think we'll just have to wait and see. And I think probably some of those things will happen gradually, and we'll learn a little more over time.
That seems to be a trend, right? It's okay. We're bearing with it.
I know.
This is a question about you, President Mangelsdorf. Have you always been in academia? And if not, what other experiences outside of academia have you had?
I've pretty much always been in academia, though my first job out of college was to work as a caseworker in a community mental health clinic, which I did for a while. And but then I went to work, left that job to work as a lab coordinator in the psychology department at the University of Pennsylvania, because I needed to get more research experience in order to go to graduate school. And so other than that one experience working, and throughout college, I had worked in various settings, both a state psychiatric hospital, the psychiatric ward of the VA hospital in Washington, another community mental health clinic in Ohio, where I went to college. So basically I've worked in higher ed and mental health, right? And they're not unrelated. Right?
And
and I had lots of jobs beginning when I was 15 that have nothing to do with it, with academia, but we all had those jobs, the waiting tables jobs, the working and clerking in stores, and so on. So.
And just so our audience knows a little bit about your background, you said you was that your undergraduate that you did in Ohio?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And following that, where did you attend grad school?
University of Minnesota.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
And so that's why when people apologize to me about the weather in Rochester, I kind of laugh. And most recently I came from being provost at University of Wisconsin-Madison, which, also just had snow, I think yesterday. So I've been in a lot of places that, where April isn't always spring.
I grew up here, and let me tell you, I'm still over it.
Yeah, no, it
was not a welcome sight today.
No, when the daffodils all drooping over in the snow, but they're tough. They'll bounce back.
As are we.
Yes.
And just, I know we have to let you go soon, but just to kind of wrap it up here, do you have any last minute thoughts you'd like to share with some of our students here listening today?
Well, I guess I might like to circle back to where I began, which is that to say, I'm really sorry we're going through this period of uncertainty. And I think it's probably way harder on graduate students than it is on me. I mean, yeah, I didn't plan on being a president during a pandemic, but on the other hand, I think I know what my job next year will be. It'll be being a president during the aftermath of the pandemic, right? And I know many of you sort of don't know exactly how it's all going to play out for you. And you know, for that, I'm sorry, and I wish we weren't going through these times. And please know we'll do everything we can to support you as best we can.
Yeah, I think we're all on that learning curve here, but
Yeah.
thank you so much for your time, and we appreciate everything that you've done so far for us as a graduate community and what you will continue to do, as you said, next year and sort of the aftermath of all of this.
Okay. Hopefully it's the aftermath. The other day I was on the elliptical and they were saying we'd be social distancing. One public health specialist, we may be social distancing until 2022. And I thought, oh no, oh please, no. So I hope we get beyond this sooner.
Definitely.
So I'm jumping in here to say that we recognize that we didn't get to all questions, particularly those specific to summer funding and healthcare, and we hope to follow up as best we can with answers to those questions soon. I do want to point students towards a number of resources that are on the COVID website, particularly the food pantry and the basic needs hub. I also want to put a plug in for a couple of Appreciation Week events coming up. Tonight, the Alliance for Diversity in Science and Engineering is hosting a Netflix party. We have a number of wellness programs tomorrow and also a game night tomorrow night hosted by Graduate Res Life. President Mangelsdorf and Katie, thank you very much for spending this time with us, and thanks to everyone else for tuning in.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Take care. Stay well.
Bye.